again, my name is Brian Lieberman. For my master's project, I was working with the Bureau of Land Management and Crestview Land Trust on a visitation study in the Slave River Valley. Really, the purpose of my project was kind of based on this observed visitation increase up in the area. This could be due to a lot of things, considering the growing state population, advances in outdoor gear, the growth in the industry, and just more advertising for this community. CBMR is experiencing similar visitation growth, and they have a much easier time of quantifying what that visitation growth looks like. However, on publicly accessible lands, it's a little bit more difficult. And if we're able to put these scientifically grounded numbers behind the visitation increase and just a baseline of use in that area, it allows management agencies a much more powerful tool to request funding to support management strategies, update facilities, and really an idea of how to balance social and environmental values on these lands. So again, there's a lack of a defined entry point for most publicly accessible lands, and there's no ticket system or anything like that. So it can be quite difficult to quantify, and that's why these in-depth projects are necessary for it. We used an integrated approach using different techniques in order to get at how many people are out there using these lands, and then this definitely has an economic ramification, especially for the town, as they want to push either more people to come in to spend more money, but that could be resulting in environmental degradation on our lands. But first, the very first step is just getting an idea of how many people are out there. So this study was guided by some project goals, mainly figuring out an accurate visitation count. Other visitation studies have been much more surface level. We really wanted to get an in-depth idea of what visitation is looking like in this area. Also quantifying what recreational uses are going on out there, the amount of locals versus in-town residents, and locals versus out-of-town residents, and how those out-of-town residents are hearing about the trail opportunities out there, and then how visitation is influenced by in-town events and weddings. So our study region is just northwest of Crested Butte, Colorado. It's on lands that are administered by the BLM or owned and administered by the Crested Butte Land Trust. We'll take a little bit closer look. We broke our entire study area into 4 distinct regions. These were based on existing geographical constraints as well as an observed idea of how people use the lands. The loop-in zones and the lower loops are characterized as single track areas. The O.B. Joyful campground up there is definitely a campground. And then the Peanut Lake is kind of a mix. It's just right outside of the town of Crested Butte. It sees a lot of different uses. So if we're looking at methodologies for this approach, we have already defined our study area. We also needed to look at what our study time period throughout the summer would be. We went from Memorial Day through Labor Day as one of the busier times for the region, and then as well as a study period during the day, which we went from 8 in the morning until 7 p.m. The integrated approach for monitoring used observational data, infrared counting technology, and survey data. Where applicable, it was preferred to use all 3 of these methods, particularly to address different project objectives. But given terrain kind of constraints as well as regulatory constraints, not all these methods could be utilized. So some specific ones were really the main indicators of what visitation looked like. And then as in-depth of a project as this is, I can't be monitoring at all those areas for 24/7 throughout the summer, so we had to have some sort of system to standardize and generalize the information from the monitoring periods and come up with total numbers for the entire summer. So we used standardized entry points to collect data as well as monitoring periods so that everything was kind of standardized in order to be able to generalize throughout the entire summer. And then calibrating error was something that was used within those standardized periods on our infrared trail counters. This is an up-close look at the upper-lower gun sight zone. This is where the lower loop trail system is. It's a very complex network of trails, so in order to effectively assess visitation, we elected to use 4 visitation counters, which are represented with a circle and the arrow. The hope was that most visitation, or most users in the area would either be seen by the monitor or hit at least one of these visitation counters. And then the next goal of the monitor was to identify if these users hit more than one during a single trip, because they should only be counted once. So that was how we calibrated error. There was a systematic scheme for that. So moving on to the results, most zones saw about 34 to 42,000 visitors annually, with the Lieberman zone being the exception as it's a little bit further out of town and a little bit more of a technical trail. The OB Joyful zone took the most amount of visitors. The different colored bars represent what the main method was for informing those visitation numbers given the restraints. And because we divided our entire study region into 4 zones, it's difficult to, you couldn't just add all 4 of these up to say that that was our number for the entire study area. But it was noted that most users don't, at a single trip, go in between OB Joyful and the other 3 zones. So you could add the OB Joyful with the Peanut Lake area to say about 80,000 users came to, at least 80,000 users came to our study area throughout our summer. So this is a look at visitation throughout the summer from the zones that had a visitation counter in them. This allows us to look at what types of holidays or events really produce the highest numbers of visitation, giving managers an idea for the coming summers of when we're going to see that really, really heavy use. And there's a lot of implications that range from parking to education to just crowding and other things like that happen out on the trails. And it's good to be equipped ahead of time and knowing which holidays are going to be the busiest. One of our next objectives was looking at recreational activities. This is important for managers as they plan the future of trail systems as well as they do updates. Knowing that biking is predominant use in the Peanut Lake area as well as on the lower loop trails in the Lieberman zone, managers can make trail features that are desirable for biking, such as bank turns or other kind of fun and playful trail features, but it's also noted that equestrian users are there as well as hiking, so gates for equestrian users and a little bit more tamer trails are also necessary for those hikers. And in the OB Joyful zone, biking was not the predominant use, it was hiking and some day use activities such as swimming and tanning and hanging out and those type of activities, but the other 3 zones were comparable to this graph. One of our next goals, which was addressed through the surveys, was looking at the amount of out-of-town visitors compared to in-town locals using the trails. So we saw in all zones about 41 to about 43% of survey participants noted that they lived in Gunnison County full-time. Yet you see from about 56 to 59% of people said that they were either second homeowners or that they were predominantly visitors in the area. And this is an important element to identify as managers look to think about how we communicate with a recreation group. For the in-town residents, possibly things like community radio, putting press releases in any of the newspapers, volunteer organizations or kind of gatherings. All of those can be opportunities to get certain messages across about trails, such as seasonal trail closures, or the importance of grazing and watching out for cattle when they're out on the trails, or any other kind of overarching themes that need to be out there. The visitors, however, we need to look at other ways to communicate with. And one of the first ways is identifying how our visitors are already hearing about our trail system. So the friends and the been here before section, those people may be a little bit difficult to get a message out and communicate with, but a lot of these other visitors are hearing about our trails either online or from the rec pamphlet that the Chamber of Commerce puts out, or from local retail stores. So managers could have the opportunity to discuss with these types of people who are either organizing or own the store and also tell them about relevant information, whether it's regarding parking or again those seasonal trail closures, just to help inform a better, I guess, educated recreational community. So one of our other goals was looking at overnight use at OB Joyful. It was quantifying the amount of campsites that were in use every night. You can see a pretty steady upward trend until the 4th of July, which we had almost 70 sites in use, and it stayed busy throughout July. And the Wildflower Festival and all the other festivals that they have up there starting to tilt off until Labor Day. We see a spike again. These are just some other numbers for the campsite data. We also counted tents out there, as sometimes it was difficult monitoring to distinguish which people are occupying a different campsite. So just counting the number of tents was also an informative way to see how many people are out there. And this is good for different updates that you can look at for different campsites, as well as just in Crescent View. There seems to be somewhat of a shortage of camping availability in the 5 drainages leaving out there. So just the first step before any managing or any planning can happen is just gaining this type of data. So this is informed through our vehicle counter that was out at OB Joyful. This kind of stair-step pattern of visitation throughout the week was noted in all 4 zones, and the weekdays in general had 30% more visitation. The weekends had 30% more visitation than the weekdays. Another huge aspect of recreation planning, as well as just monitoring for my project, is looking at vehicle parking for your trail system. As numbers begin to grow and we see more people using the trails, it's going to be very important to think about where are these people going to park before they access the trails. So both of these lots, this is the Slate River Winter Trailhead at the bottom of the Loop and 2 trail, and the Lower Loop Trailhead out at the Lower Loop system. Both of these parking lots are pretty small, and they're not capable of handling a large amount of people parking there before people start to just drive off and park wherever they can find, and often causing resource damage. So that study period averages are not looking too alarming for the size of those parking lots, but some of these maximum days where there's a lot of people out there, there might need to be a way to address the amount of people that are parking at the trails. And one of the ways we can look at that, and this was also addressed through surveys, was asking people where do they start. If you think back to that first map, these trails are pretty accessible from town. You can park in town, or people who live in town can just ride out to the trails. And that made up a substantial amount of people, about 57% of survey respondents saying that they start their trip in town. But 34 people, and this is specifically for the Lower Loop zone, said that they do drive out to the Lower Loop Trailhead to start their trail. And even with just it being 34% of the people, we're already experiencing some overflow parking at that lot, and it can cause a lot of senses of crowding, as well as just being kind of a nuisance to get in and out of there. So again, just thinking about the slide before, how do we communicate with the recreational population to say that, you know, it's very easy if you are capable to park in town and access these trails instead of trying to drive out and park in a small parking lot, would be something worth investigating. So looking at some discussion and limitations, my project was a fairly in-depth way of looking at visitation out on publicly accessible lands. There's a lot of time commitment. I spent about 40 hours each week just monitoring, and then there's a huge part of it putting it in to data analysis and producing these types of numbers. So looking at ways to decrease the amount of time that a physical person has to be out there would allow these recreational entities to take these projects on in-house. If we're going to continue to have really in-depth monitoring processes, then we'll need people like graduate students or other outside entities to do these. The infrared trail counters were an extraordinarily effective tool for measuring visitation use. They do have some limitations though, as they require a single track area to be really effective, because if you think about it, it's got like a laser that protrudes from it, and every time it's interrupted, it counts 1. So if it's not like a trail that kind of corrals people onto a single file line, it's not going to be an effective tool. So in our OB Joyful campground, we could not use infrared counters, and we just attempted to count people in that whole area, and they can really spread it pretty far out, and that was very difficult. So there's definitely room to figure out how to quantify recreational use on a large recreational area. The observational data and surveys were fairly effective. People were definitely willing when you'd ask them to stop for a survey. Not everybody was, but it was a good opportunity to figure out more than you would from just the observational data about what's happening out on the lands. And then, well, yeah, I hit most of those limited suggestions, so I'll just move on to questions. Yes.
So in your surveys, what were some of the reasons why people, from outside the area came to, the Looping Trail, or just some of these, or just the Lower Loop, or just
Sure.
Be Joyful in general?
Sure. I didn't really have a metrics to quantify that on my survey. We stuck pretty to just about 6 questions. I wanted to get people to say, hey, this is a real quick survey. Take this and you can keep on going with your day. But just from talking to folks about the trails, it seemed like the Lieberman Trail, the Lower Loop Trail, they were often pointed in that direction if they were visitors from out of town, whether it was from a friend or from somebody else just saying, oh, you're in Crested Butte, you have to ride these trails. It's really beautiful scenery. The trails aren't that difficult. It's capable of most people's skill level, even on biking, that you could do these trails. And they just seem to be sort of kind of more of an iconic area that if you're gonna come to Crested Butte, yeah, you gotta hit the 401, you gotta do these other ones, but for a good start, and it's just so close to town, why not do the Lieberman Trail? Sure.
Is there any discussion about, instead of like expanding parking or getting people to park in town when they're using the trails, like some sort of transportation system?
Sure. Looking out towards things like Gothic, I know that there's been a lot of things to say, how can we get people out there? Not so much for the Lieberman Trail and the lower loops, as they're just so close to town that the most effective way, especially if you're biking, and as we see it's pretty heavily biking uses out in there, it's so much easier just to start at town, and it's not really a huge climb to get out to most of those trails. So I'd say that would just be the best way to kind of promote people to think about not driving out there, is just to either bike out there or just, there's also a single track that leaves right from town. So if you just want to go for a hike, you can start hiking right from that single track. Sure.
So on one of your slides, you had shown that there was a different number of parking spaces at different times of the year. Is that?
No, so what that slide was showing was just breaking it down, because if you looked at that visitation graph during July, it's just insane, even the difference between June and August from July. So that was just showing the averages by each of the day, or by each month. That it's almost, on average, there's almost 5 more cars parked in a 4-hour span in this lot than say June or August. Yeah, sure.
What do you think the most useful out of all the things you learned will be to management in the end?
That's a good question. I think really just the importance of gathering this data in order to make management decisions, or if you're going to change anything about the way that you do, and especially in a community like Crested Butte where folks are super into their recreation. It seems like it's really important to have these numbers saying like, oh, why did you do that? Well, according to our study, this is the amount of people out here, this is how many people are parking in the parking lot, and you can see the damage that these cars are making. So we need to rethink our strategy based on data. Sure.
So I know that some organizations in Crested Butte and throughout the valley, including the Gunnison Crested Butte Tourism Association, are interested in perhaps launching a campaign that'll kind of address some of these issues of loving our land to death.
Sure.
Do you think that studies such as this could be utilized in those techniques that are used by those organizations that are interested in launching that?
Yeah, probably just getting an idea of, I had so much data that in a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation, it was hard to include everything, but having data about where people are coming from to use the trails and just the amount of people out there, I think, again, speaking to making decisions based on data, it'd be probably a first good step for them if they were going to do any sort of campaign and say, like, this is our basis, this is kind of how we know where people are coming from, and yeah, just launch it from there.
And so is this information available to utilize for that, and to chat with you or the BLM? Or?
Yeah, you can definitely have to talk to the BLM and the Crested Butte Land Trust before that, but they're definitely, I guess, willing to at least talk. Yeah. Yeah, and I want to say a quick thank you to Christy Murphy, who was one of my sponsors from the BLM, as well as Sally Thode, my advisor, and then all you guys, too. Yeah. If anybody, there's, I think, one last question, too. Sure,
To be quick. It sounds like you kept your survey pretty short, but did you ever think about collecting visitor experience data, like on 4th of July?
Yeah, I definitely thought about it. It's just tricky when you're working with a federal land management agency, and we were so close, the land trust is so close to BLM lands there, that would get a little tricky. Once you start asking those questions, it has to go through a review process at the federal level. So we kind of strayed away from doing that, just considering regulatory constraints, and just went with these really quick think the most amount of questions were 9 on there. And I was really concerned because I know that people recreating, they're not going to want to stop and talk for too long. So I just wanted to get that quick information and get them back on the trail. It's like they're out of time, so cool. Thanks, guys.